Hello. We're going to go over the 5th session of the info session series. This will be our info session about accessory sounds. So first, we're going to talk about a little bit about the background of me, the person who's presenting the information to you. So I'm not a speech pathologist, and I'm not a career professional. So this isn't something that I do for my living. This isn't what I'm doing sort of day to day. So I have less practice at this than somebody who has a degree might have, or somebody who's been trained to do this for years and years and years and years. That said, I do have 20 plus years of various vocal experience, including singing, acting, voice acting, other recordings, that kind of thing. And I am also currently learning to teach from a career professional, so I am being mentored by somebody who does this as her day job, and who is in the process of getting a degree in speech pathology. So there is a lot of backing up to the information that I've got. I'm getting it from a reputable place, and I'm learning from her how to teach it to you. So. Tips for healthy practice, and this one's especially important for today. We want to make sure that we're always warming up before we practice, no matter how little or how much practice you plan to do. Always make sure that you're warming up in advance, especially relevant for when we're practicing accessory sounds, because a lot of them can be quite hard on the voice. So I want to make sure that you're getting your voice into a nice, healthy, warmed up spot before you start doing any of this stuff that can be kind of harsh on the vocal tract. Keep hydrated, again, especially for this lesson. Water is your best option. There are some other options, but generally speaking, it's best if you can stick to water because it's the most hydrating and the least likely to give you any other sort of effects on the voice, which we don't want. If you feel any pain, strain, or tension as you practice, make sure to stop. Make sure to take time to recover and rest. Is, again, additionally important for this lesson in particular, since there can be a lot of things that can cause that strain and tension to come in quite quickly. And finally, if you're ever instructed by any resource that you find on the internet to try and swallow and then hold the top position of the swallow, please don't do this. It's an outdated practice. It's no longer used because it can cause pain, strain, and in the worst cases, choking. So please don't do that. It's something we're, sort of moving away from to make sure that everybody stays healthy and doesn't damage their voices. Finally, and this will apply somewhat today, the way that I was taught to teach and the way that I pass along info is having whoever is learning sort of learn a little bit over the top, learn sort of in almost an actor kind of way, and then dial it back to what makes more sense, what's a little more natural, what's sort of more comfortable for the voice that they're aiming for. This just helps us separate the old voice that we're sort of used to, that we're habituated to, and the sort of new target voice. Helps us keep them separate, helps us stop from sort of drifting from one into the other by accident, and helps us stop creating any bad habits. So moving right along, what are accessory sounds? So the first thing we're talking about is what we're actually, looking at for accessory sounds. Accessory sounds are the voicing that tends to come along with body processes or autonomous processes, things that you're doing that you don't necessarily think about but still have a sort of voicing to them. Laughing, crying, coughing, sneezing, yawning, all these kinds of things have a sort of sound associated with them that comes at least in part from your vocal tract. So we want to be able to adjust those to something that makes us comfortable, something that makes us euphoric, something that feels right for our voice. Now, that said, this isn't the case for everybody. Lots of people have sort of a different way of doing each of these different processes. Some people have a sneeze that sounds like they're yelling, but a laugh that basically doesn't make any sound at all, or they cough quite quietly, but they, yawn quite loudly, things like that. It'll be different from each person to each other person as to how it sounds for you. So take all of this information as something that you should apply when it becomes relevant for what sounds you're making, and always keep in mind that this is not a sort of prescriptive thing. It should always sound the way you want it to. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. So if you hear some advice that sort of doesn't sit with you right, or doesn't make your voice sound the way you want it to, just skip it. Just take a pass on it. That's all good. What isn't an accessory sound? So, vocal affectations like accents, mannerisms, phrases that you repeat on a regular basis. These are all affectations to the voice, but they're not accessory sounds. They are things that come along with speaking. They're not something that's sort of coming along with something else that your body does that sort of creates a voiced situation. And they're not speech apraxias, speech disorders, or speech impediments. Those are just part of the way that a lot of people speak. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't want to be trying to take these out. We don't want to be trying to remove these in this session or in this even this whole series really. That's not something I'm qualified to do. That's not something I'm qualified to help with. And you also don't need to if it's not something that you're worried about. So it's totally up to you, but that's not what we're dealing with today either. How do we affect them? So there's a lot of ways that we can affect other pieces of the voice. This one in particular is tricky to get your head around. It's a very difficult thing to practice. It's a very difficult thing to sort of adjust. It does take a lot of time. It takes a little bit of luck, and it takes a lot of awareness. So the first thing we sort of look at when it comes to practicing and changing our accessory sounds is lots and lots of practice. Anything that you can practice, anything you can sort of make a passable fake of. So if you can fake laugh, if you can fake cough, if you can fake yawn, any of those things, or if you can cause those things to happen on command, that's also good. That can help with this. But by and large, it's just a lot of trying to sort of practice whenever you get the opportunity, whenever it comes up naturally. The next one is forming habits. This is just sort of getting yourself into a spot where every time something is about to happen, you sort of think to yourself at least that it's going to happen. You don't necessarily need to change it every time, but just sort of getting into the habit of realizing when you're about to have a sneeze, a cough, a yawn, whatever, is super, super useful because it'll come up later. Other voice work really helps with this. Anything we do to change our resonance, change our vocal weight, all those kinds of things, knowing how to do that first and foremost is super helpful for sort of the adjustments that we're planning to make here. But also on top of that, as you sort of get more and more used to the new target voice you're aiming for, and learn how to sort of move that sort of default spot up a little bit, move it to a brighter space, move it to a lighter space, whatever it is you're adjusting to make your voice sound like the target voice you want. It will sort of create a new default for you, and by and large, your accessory sounds tend to hang out where the default of your voice is. So as you get brighter and as your voice sort of starts to take on this new quality, as you practice your voice, so too will your accessory sounds. Mimicry can be super useful for this, especially when we're just starting out. It is a little tricky, but it is something that's super helpful as a tool. So listening to somebody who's got a voice that's similar to what you want your target voice to sound like, listening to how they laugh, listening to how they yawn, listening to what it sounds like when they sneeze, that kind of thing, can be super, super useful for learning what the sort of presentation or delivery of each of those things is, as much as we can call it that, for that person, and something that might sound natural to you, or for you if you're using it that way. And finally, awareness. I was talking about forming habits before. Awareness of when you're going to suddenly find yourself with an opportunity to practice one of these things is super key. You want to be aware of when it's going to happen, and if you've got the sort of wherewithal in that split second, you want to try and make adjustments before whatever autonomous process makes itself happen. So if you have that feeling of, oh, I'm about to sneeze, taking that moment to think to yourself, okay, try and keep it a little brighter, okay, try and keep it a little higher, whatever it is that you're sort of changing when it comes to your accessory sounds, having that moment of awareness is super key and super helpful if you can do it. What we need to be careful of, vocal strain is always going to be on the list of things we need to be careful of. These ones especially can be really, really tough on the stamina, so we want to be very, very careful that we stop as soon as we need to. If you feel any sort of hoarseness, any roughness, any scratchiness, any kind of pain or discomfort, you want to stop practicing these right away. An unnatural lack of variation is next on our list here. We want to be careful that we don't just do the same thing over and over and over again. We don't want it to be, sort of the same laugh every time or the same yawn every time. Somebody described it to me really, really well as you don't want it to sound like you are playing the same MP3 file of your voice over and over and over again. You want it to sound a little bit different each time. You want there to be a little bit of variation each time, because the natural sound of the voice has variation and change, and will be a little bit different from context to context. So we want to make sure that even if the laugh sounds mostly the same, it's a little bit different each time. Even if the yawn sounds mostly the same, it's a little bit different every time. So that's what we're aiming for here. An unnatural tone mismatch. Now this one isn't a hard and fast rule, but we do want to be aware of what our voice typically sounds like. We want to be aware of how we usually sound when we speak, how we sound when we're talking to other people, that kind of thing. And then we want to try and match the accessory sounds by and large to the way that our sort of standard speaking voice sounds. So we don't want to be in a spot where we're talking in this low, sultry voice, but then all of our sneezes and laughs and stuff are up here. It doesn't really line up terribly well one with the other. Now that said, not everybody's accessory sounds actually do line up with their speech. Some of them are very, very different from the way they sound when they talk. But generally speaking, it makes more sense to people, and you will get less raised eyebrows if those two sort of go hand in hand, if they're a little bit closer to each other. And finally, we don't want to prevent or impede the actual process. So if we're in a spot where we're trying to cough, we don't want to think to ourselves, oh, I need to do some voice training, and then get stuck sort of halfway through the cough. We don't want to stop ourselves. We want to sort of get in our own way. We want to make sure that we let whatever process is happening happen. It's happening for a reason. Your body is doing it for a reason. So we want to make sure that we don't get in the way of that reason, whatever it happens to be, whether that's clearing things out of your airway, whether that's dislodging some mucus from the back of your throat, all these kinds of things. It's all important to let it happen, let it do its thing. So try not to get in the way of whatever the process is when you're trying to affect the way that it sounds. It's actually quite important. So let's go over some of the exercises. I've already warmed up today, but in case you haven't, generally speaking, when it comes to starting with accessory sounds, I recommend you do a lot of warming up before you get started. You'll always want to make sure you're doing some warming up, but I recommend more warming up for the accessory sounds than you typically do for other vocal exercises. You can do anything that you've done for any of the other lessons in this series. That can include big dog, small dog, that can include whisper sirens, that can include deep breaths, that can include lip trills, that can include vowel shifting, that can include pitch variations, anything you like. But make sure you do lots of them and lots of repetitions of each one before you get to changing your accessory sounds or exercises for accessory sounds, because it takes a lot out of your voice and you want to make sure you're in great shape to start doing it before you actually start doing it. So with that all in mind, and assuming you've paused and come back after you've done your warm-up or you've already warmed up today, let's go on to the exercises. So it's a pretty cut and dry process. It's just tough to do. What we're going to do here is sort of in a few parts. The first part is mimicry. We're going to listen to somebody who has a target voice, somebody who has a voice that's similar to the way we want to sound, somebody who's got a voice that's similar to our target voice. We're going to listen to what it sounds like when they laugh, what it sounds like when they sneeze, what it sounds like when they cough. We're going to listen for a few things. The first thing is, where does the sound come in? Or does it? There's a lot of instances, like we were talking about before, where people will do something devoiced. So, for example, if I cough with a voiced sound, you can hear that sound underneath. That's the voiced sound. However, some other people cough with a devoiced sound, which sounds like this. Little to no sound going on in there. So, first thing to recognize, does this person whose voice is similar to your voice or devoice this accessory sound? You can do the same or you can change it. It's up to you. And the same is true of any of the sounds that we're doing. You can change from voiced to devoiced, and that's not something you have to stick with, even if you choose one or the other to begin with or to be the thing that you do most often. Sometimes people who have devoiced coughs will cough with a bit of voicing if it's a heavier cough, for example. There's lots of variety going on here. But generally speaking, especially when we're starting out, we want to look specifically at what the voice of the person with the sort of reference close to our target voice sounds like when they do all of these things. Once we have that, we'll sort of be listening to whether they do it voiced or devoiced, what the sort of pitch variation sounds like, or if they make any pitch at all, and then where everything sort of comes in terms of rhythm. So we'll go over all of that for each of these things that we've got below. Let's do that now. So, identification and analysis. We're going to start by identifying each of the parts of each of these different accessory sounds as we go, and then trying to make sure that each of them sounds the way we want them to. So we'll start with coughing. Coughing, if you devoice it, sounds like this. Just the air moving through, no tone, no sound, like no pitch associated. So that's all we're looking for. If that's all you want to do, that's great. basically any of these exercises or any of these accessory sounds can be done in a devoiced way, and it'll sound totally normal, and also tends to take it away from the mask end of the spectrum. So if you're just looking for the sort of first step, devoicing all of these sounds would be the way I would recommend. Once you've got there, though, if you feel like you want to add some of the tone back in, the thing that I would recommend next is identifying where that tone comes in. So if I cough with a fairly dark sound, there's the k, and then there's the sort of hard K almost at the front, and then there's the grunt almost underneath. So devoicing it, we take away the grunt. It's just that K. And then if we want to add the grunt back in, but we want to make it more towards our target voice, we might do something like making it a higher pitch. Making it a brighter sound. So it's finding those two pieces, figuring out how they go together, figuring out the order they come along in, and then adjusting them to fit what makes sense to you. Next up is throat clearing. So if I do it with a dark sound, it's basically just a grunt. What we're getting there is the same sort of feeling as if we're doing a cough, but we're doing it with our mouth closed, and we're doing it through an M at our lips. So we've taken it all apart. Let's identify each of those pieces. So first, the cough sort of K sound, and then the grunt sort of at the front, at the top. What we're going to do here is take that grunt or sort of sound away. Sounds like a car motor trying to get started. And then once we've done that, once we've taken it away, we can put it back in, but we can change the way that it sounds. We can raise the pitch, we can change the brightness, whatever you like. So then it becomes it's a little bit higher for me, and it's a little bit brighter for me. Generally speaking, working with pitch and resonance are going to be the way that you're going with all of this. A lot of these tend to sort of affect vocal weight on their own, so changing the way that the vocal weight sounds as you do these is going to be even harder. Typically recommend just sticking to pitch and resonance for this. Next up is laughing. This one's tricky, and it will especially be important to work with some mimicry here. We want to listen to the way that the reference we're using laughs. We want to listen to what it sounds like melodically. Do they go up? Do they go down? Do they stay in the same area? Do they follow a fairly regular pattern, or does it sort of just random all the time? Do they laugh higher than their usual speaking voice? Do they laugh lower than that? Do they sort of move around it? What does it sound like when they do that? Is it fast? Is it slow? Is their mouth open? Is it closed? All sorts of different pieces that you can use for analyzing what a laugh sounds like. Generally speaking, if you're looking for sort of a basic framework to work off of, and you're just going for sort of that basic light chuckle, what I typically recommend is thinking about where your typical speaking voice sits, laughing up, laughing down, and then laughing back to the middle of where you sort of usually speak. So, sorry. Also in laughing, some people find that the outward sound doesn't work quite well for them. If you want to, you can try the inward laugh instead. So rather than you can try which is just doing the same thing, but bringing it inwards instead of pushing it outwards. If you get into a really sort of thick fit of laughter, you'll often find that this comes along as you're trying to breathe while laughing. So that may help you. That feeling may be one that you're actually familiar with if you sort of find the right context for it. Next up is sneezing. We want to find the two things that we're working on here. So the first is the expulsion of air, and the other one is the sort of tone that we've got going on underneath. You're noticing a theme here of the different pieces that we're working on. They tend to have the expulsion of the air and the tone going on underneath. Those are the parts we're taking apart. Sneezing. If I sneeze with a fairly dark tone, or a fairly dark resonance, sorry, it's got the chew sound, it's got the underneath, and it's got the expulsion of air at the top. So if we take those pieces apart, three different pieces. We're going to put those sort of together in different combinations. So first, if we want to devoice, it's just going to be the expulsion of air and the sound chew, but we're not going to put any tone on it. So it's going to sound like this. Or if we want to add a little bit of tone back in, but we don't want to have that sort of chew sound in the middle, we can have Not a lot of people sneeze like this, but some people do, so it's important to include it as an example if that's something that you're looking for. And then finally, and this is the way that I typically sneeze, is adding all those pieces together and taking that underlying sound, bringing it up in pitch a little bit, and bringing it brighter on the resonance side of things. So, now this is one that's a sort of, we were talking about unnatural tone mismatch. I spend a lot of time speaking in the sort of lower registers. My voice is by and large quite thin, and it tends to be a little bit smokier, a little bit more vocal fry going on here and there, which means that this sort of high sound is a little bit out of character for the way my voice sounds. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a perfect match for every accessory sound, and that's only when I've got a smaller sneeze. If I got a really big one, it's usually just going to be devoiced and oops, all air for me. So this is sort of what I mean in terms of the variety and the uniqueness of each of these different sort of accessory sounds. Lots of different ways to go about them, lots of variety, even within one person's sort of repertoire of accessory sounds as well. So don't feel like you have to keep yourself constrained to the same thing every time. Yawning is next. Some people can do this one on command, which is super helpful for this. So the two things that we're going to look for are the expulsion of air and the sound underneath. So we've got the and the that underneath is almost like a sigh, if you were just sort of saying the sounds that come along when you sigh. So what we're going to do here is, if we've got a darker sound, it sounds like this. We're going to take that darker sound away. Move to a devoiced sound. If you want to stay there, all good. If you don't want to stay there, you can move to the sort of brighter, lighter sound by making that sort of underlying tone that we had before, that we just took out for the devoicing. We can add that back in, but make it a little bit brighter, make the pitch a little bit higher, whatever makes sense for you. In my case, I soften it a little bit. So I make it a little bit quieter than if I have that sort of dark tone going on. And I also make it a little bit brighter. That's what I typically aim for me. When it comes to yawning in particular, make sure that you have a little bit of air sort of leave your lungs before that tone starts. So one more time. There's a little bit of that before I start doing the part of the yawn. Lastly, we're going to look at crying. Now, first things first, if you're crying, and you're crying for sad reasons, if you're distressed, if you're distraught, if you're upset, this is not the time to be thinking of vocal feminization. It's not going to help you. It's not going to make you feel better. Just let the cry happen. It's cathartic. It's good for you. It's good to get it out. If you're in a spot where you're crying happy tears, or you're crying because something is getting you emotional, but like in a good way, something's just so overwhelming, or it's so cute, or you're just, your heart is melting, something's very romantic, that kind of thing, that's an okay time to be thinking about, oh, I wonder if I could make this sound more in line with the way that I want it to sound. Generally speaking, if we're devoicing our crying sound, we're going from taking the big sort of sobs out, and we're aiming for sort of more of that smaller sniffling sound. If you want to add tone back in, it gets tricky, but you can put it in those sort of bigger inhalations, those bigger sort of inward sobs. Generally speaking, if you're crying and speaking at the same time, it should adopt a little bit of the voice work you've been doing already so far. But again, if you're crying and trying to speak at the same time, probably you're focusing on enough already, so you don't really need to think about this for now. If you're having a little happy cry and you're wanting to add a little bit of tone in, you can add some tone on those bigger inhalations. So try and keep your vocal tract very thin, very small. Keep that space as little as you can to increase that resonance quite a bit. Resonance is going to be your best friend when it comes to inhalation sounds like this, just because it's more of a sort of shape of the vocal tract kind of thing, as opposed to the air or the tone. There's not even really a lot of tone going on when you can a little bit, but by and large, it's mostly to do with the amount of space that's going on in the vocal tract. So that's what we want to focus on when it comes to crying. There are other accessory sounds, of course. There's screaming, there's hiccups, there's burping, all these kinds of things. But for the sake of people who don't like burping, I won't do that here. For the sake of people who can't do hiccups on the command, which I think is pretty much everybody, practicing that is basically impossible. Do your best if you have the hiccups to sort of think about it, I guess, but it's not something that's really mandatory. And screaming is not something you can practice comfortably or safely, so only do it as a absolute last resort. If you need to, just fucking send your voice as high as you can get it and just let it peter off at as high a tone as you can possibly manage. And keep your vocal tract in as small a position as you can. But also, if you're in a spot where you're screaming for help, prioritize getting yourself to safety first. Prioritize getting the help that you need before you're starting to think about this. If you can if you're maybe practicing it for theater, that's the only situation I can think of where you would be able to practice this without distressing people. Still be very, very careful of your voice, because screaming is very, very difficult to do in a way that is not damaging or not harming your voice in some way or other, causing a lot of strain. So if you're going to do that, be very, very careful. And the same goes too for coughing and throat clearing. They're very tough on the voice. They take a lot of vocal stamina. They can cause a lot of strain. Already, just from recording this video, I can feel some scratchiness in my throat coming on. I'm going to hydrate a bunch after this, and typically I recommend doing maybe 1 or 2 coughs and 1 or 2 throat clears, absolute maximum. So that's 4 of these tough sounds ever in a session before you take a full day's rest. Be very, very careful with your voice when you're practicing this kind of stuff. That's the last sort of piece of information we've got here. And that's the end of the video. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the server. There's the vocal feminization channel as well as the VT general channel. And if you'd like to contribute to my coffee, I have that there. But again, please don't feel obligated. This is not the kind of thing that I'm doing for my living. This is not the kind of thing that everybody has access to, and I want to make it as accessible for as many people as possible. I'd rather it was free for everyone. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Hopefully you have a good rest of your day. I'm proud of you, and see you next time.